How's everyone doing today? Cool, excellent. Actually, ironically, we're going to talk in a little bit why there is no post-processing stack v3, and I added that title before I knew that. And so we're going to talk about the correct way of talking about this, which is the HDRP post-processing stack. My name is Mike Geig. I'm an evangelist at Unity Technologies. And hello. Howdy. All right, so fair warning before we start. Twice today, my computer is blue screened. I've updated my graphics drivers, really hoping that doesn't happen again. It's a brand new laptop, so we're going to see what happens because twice now it's crashed on me, which has made me quite nervous for today, so we'll see what happens. So today, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about sort of an overview of the post-processing stack. We're going to talk about the current problems we're trying to solve, what's new with this latest iteration, and then we're going to look at some examples in the editor, which are always more fun. So what is post-processing? So real quick here, who here has used Unity's post-processing stack before? Either version 1 or version 2, fantastic. And so post-processing, for those of you who haven't used it, post-processing is this idea that we want to take the render from the camera, what the camera sees in the 3D and 2D geometry and composites, and then we want to do something to it after the render, but before the end user sees it on the computer monitor. That's what we mean by the post process, right? This is also can be called camera effects and things like that, image effects and so on. And so effectively we're working with an image buffer and we're doing something to it. And so that allows us to take something like this. This is a scene rendered from a camera. This is something we call our Neon project, all a bunch of stuff made from the asset store. And you know, it looks fine, there's a lot of complexity, everything is cool with that, but it's fairly flat, lifeless, not a lot of emotion, not a lot of depth. We want to take something like this, and without making changes to each and every individual game object and stuff, we want to do something that enhances the overall scene. We use something like the post-processing stack to add that depth, to add that feel, that emotionality, that style, that whatever it is we're trying to achieve. Maybe we're going for something that's photorealistic, maybe we're going for something that is completely hyper-realistic or not realistic in any way, shape, or form. We can use post-processing to do that evenly across all these objects to give us some pretty cool effects. So leading up until now, we've had two versions of the post-processing stack. The post-processing stack is an evolution of what was our cinematic image effects. The post-processing stack v1, which you could get from GitHub and whatever, was great. It didn't have this concept of volumes, and it lacked a lot of different functionality, and it was fairly slow, but it was our first attempt at it. And that led us to the post-processing version 2, which you could get on GitHub or Package Manager. It's still completely active, still being used. It's still really, really good. Nothing wrong with it. However, there were some limitations in this design. And so, you know, again, as was announced, the title of this talk, Post-Processing version 3, there is no Post-Processing version 3, and there's not going to be a version 4 and so on. Instead, what we're doing here on out is we're tying the post-processing effect stack directly to our scriptable render pipeline versions. Right, so this upcoming post-processing, which you can actually get right now, is part of the HDRP. And there's a lot of reasons we're doing that. And eventually we're going to have one for lightweight render pipeline and so on. So most of the stuff I'm going to show you today applies really if you're using the HDRP, the high definition render pipeline. And in the future we'll have one for lightweight. And if you're doing standard rendering, not using the scriptable rendering pipeline, then post-processing stack version 2 still works completely fine. And that's where that's going to live for here on out. So just to reiterate, if you're used to going to Pacman or Package Manager, and for those of you who abbreviate it, it's Pacman with a P-A-C-K, not P-A-C-M-A-N, because we'd get sued. So Pacman with that K. You're used to going and grabbing the post-processing from there. You're not going to do that anymore. I just like this slide because I just wanted to put a big red X on there. Instead, you're just going to get that through the high definition render pipeline. So you grab HDRP, you get the new post-processing. It's there right now. It's ready to use. It's pretty cool. And then there's no check mark for whatever reason in PowerPoint. It's just a smiley face, so I wanted to use that instead. So why this change? Well, there are a lot of reasons for doing this, for actually tying the post-processing directly to the rendering pipeline. Well, the first is scalability is hard. Making a solution that works across all of these different potential rendering options is challenging, right? Creating a post-processing stack with a bloom effect that works for lightweight and HD and standard rendering is difficult because we don't know what type of camera we're going to use. We don't know what rendering or color path we're going to be using. We don't know anything about that. And so we have to create this really bloated piece of software that works against everything and in this kind of generic way. And so we're unable to scale in a way that really makes sense, that really allows us to grow these things towards our intended platforms. Another thing is right now, with say post-processing version 2, all of our lighting and surface data and post-processing is all kind of clumped together as post-processing. So things like ambient occlusion in post-processing v2, ambient occlusion is a post-processing effect, but it's technically a lighting effect and has to be processed accurately before the final render, not after the final render like most of our post-processing. So by tying post-processing effects, or keeping post-processing in a generic solution, we have no control over that, but by tying it to our rendering pipeline, we can break up when these things happen because we know specifically how the rendering pipeline is going to work. So we get more efficiency, more accuracy, and you're going to see there's a lot of cool things we can do with that. The next thing is we really want our high quality effects to run fully asynchronously on the high definition render pipeline, right? That means that we need to have compute shaders. And HDRP is full compute shaders, allows us to do things asynchronously. Again, allows us to push that envelope of quality and performance in a way that we couldn't rely on the lightweight to manage itself. One size doesn't fit all. I didn't write these slides, so I think some of these are just redundant. One size doesn't fit all. I think we all can recognize that, sure. Let's see here, physical light units and cameras. Now this is a huge one, and this is one we're gonna look at quite a lot. This concept of physical light units and physical camera settings. We saw this a bit in the keynote this morning, where everyone at the keynote this morning, yeah? So we saw this a bit. We're gonna look at this a little bit more in depth. What we're talking about is not just like traditional Unity lights, which just have some range and some intensity, but with the new physical light units, we have lights measured with temperature, measured by lux, candela, lumens, 100 EV, and things like that. So we have these really physically accurate lights. And what that enables me to do is enables me to go to the hardware store and pick out a light bulb, look at the rating and details on that light bulb, how many lumens it is, what the color of that light bulb is, and then come back to Unity, type in those values, and actually see what that light would be in a physical world. Physical light units, very high levels of accuracy, as well as physical camera setups. And we're gonna look at that too. It goes so far beyond what was seen maybe this morning where, hey, we can change our focal length or our aperture size. There's so much more that goes into this, and we're gonna take a look at that. Now, HDRP has that, other things do not. And so when we're talking about the absolute quality, those are things we're gonna need. Finally, what we joke around in the mode 11 or whatever, the take it to level 11, whatever you wanna call it, the highest possible level of detail. For people who are doing things like films, cinematics, 3D renders, things that are not necessarily games that have to run at 60 seconds. Maybe I'm someone making a film, and my stuff can render at 5 frames a second, right? That's not really game level of speed. However, compared to most film, that's amazingly fast when we're talking about studios that render maybe 1 frame every 30 minutes. The ability to do 2 or 3 per second is huge. And that means that with the HDRP post-processing, we want to enable you to push these limits of graphical quality to a level that, sure, that may make it unplayable for a game, but a lot of people aren't making games, right? So we want to be able to push this even higher, even further. Pardon me, I need some water. All right, so let's talk about physical camera settings. Are they really that important? And the answer really is it depends. It depends on what you're doing, all right? These are for people who want that absolute level of realism, photorealism, and capability. And so I'm going to give us an example here. So this is an actual camera lens, right, in the real world. And we can see that there's an aperture, the aperture of a lens being the hole in the center of the lens. The larger the number, the smaller the hole, and vice versa, right? And then the apertures are formed by these blades. And these blades, move together to open and close this aperture. Now, using a post-processing stack V2 with, say, standard rendering or lightweight rendering, we effectively get a one-size-fits-all solution as far as camera aperture goes. Even if I can define what the aperture is in sort of a physical-based rendering, I don't really get realistic results. And let me show you what I mean. So this is what the bokeh being that sort of fuzzy bit, looks like in a out-of-focus image, right? This is what the bokeh looks like if you have an aperture with 7 blades. All right, seems reasonable, seems completely straightforward, why not? All right, and this is great for most of your whatever, I need bokeh, I'm trying to get some realistic effects, whatever. But let's say we want to push this to an even higher level with the new physical camera stuff with the HDRP. Well, maybe I say, well, you know what? I want this to look like I'm using a camera with 5 blades for its aperture. Okay. With physical camera setup, with the HDRP post-processing, we can certainly do that. Sure, that's something that maybe some people won't notice, but it's that extra detail. HDRP is for people that want that extra bit of detail for as accurate as possible. I also like that the 3 blades kind of looks like the Unity logo. It's kind of neat. We can take that even further. So sure, blade count affects what that bokeh looks like. But now let's look at how aperture affects the shape or the blade attribution to the bokeh. So this is an f1.8 aperture, which is a fairly open aperture for anyone who does photography or videography or whatever. And this is, again, your standard bokeh. So the larger the aperture or the more open the aperture, the rounder your bokeh. But again, with the physical camera setup, we have the ability to really determine how the aperture controls the amount of effect the blades have on the bokeh of an image. I mean, these are, again, little subtle things, but post-processing really is about little and subtle. It's about all of these little things that come together to make an effect just really look amazing, really look accurate, right? So things that you wouldn't even consider that, hey, my bokeh is round. Why is my bokeh round? Well, maybe it's because the aperture is wide open, and so the blade count won't really matter. And we also have things like blade curvature and stuff that I'm not going to get into all of these little examples, but these are all, we actually have like 6 different things that will define the shape of bokeh for depth of field based on your physical camera settings. And that's only bokeh for depth of field, not to mention all of the other things we can do with physical cameras and stuff, not to mention all the other things we can do with the rest of post-processing. So it just grows and grows and grows, the level of detail and the things that we can achieve. So what else is new? And we'll have one more slide here, and then we're going to actually hop into the editor, which is much more of what I prefer. So new stuff. There are no more post-processing volumes or layers. Okay, so before, if you use post-processing, you're used to adding the post-process layer to the camera and the post-process volume to some game object and creating a profile for that and whatever. Well, that doesn't exist anymore. Now we're going to see that all of the things we need to set up post-processing are baked into the camera itself. It just assumes that if you're using one of these scriptable rendering pipelines, if you're using the high-definition render pipeline, you're just planning on using post-processing. There are no more post-processing volumes. They're now just part of the HDRP volume setup, which is something that's just part of our scriptable rendering pipeline to begin with. And so they're all combined, and they all work together natively. Anti-aliasing is directly on the camera now, so it's much easier to access. Things like depth of field, exposure, bloom are all physically affected by our cameras. We're going to see that color grading, I don't know if you all remember color grading, it was probably our biggest and most in-depth post-processing effect. Color grading has grown even more with more and more stuff. And to keep things manageable, it's actually been split up into like 8 different post-processing effects. So now the feel we're going for is to make it feel a lot more like using like Photoshop adjustment layers. All right, so you don't necessarily need to add one giant monolithic effect. Instead, you can add just the pieces that you need to make things much easier. And performance. Because we're building the post-processing effect stack directly for HDRP, we don't have to worry about, should this work in lightweight? Will this have to work in standard? And so we can tailor things specifically to the rendering pipeline, and that means things are faster. As an example, Bloom, specifically, is 160% faster on HDRP post-processing than it was in version 2 on any of the other rendering pipelines, right? So, and that's just the one example I have the stats for off the top of my head, but that sort of performance gain and efficiency and stuff is what we can get when we're working directly with the rendering pipeline. So, all right, so let's hop over to the editor. And so this is going to look familiar. This is the Heretic, which we saw in the keynote and such. And one thing to note here is that I actually have like post-processing not on the screen. You're right, thank you. That was a test. You all passed. So it took a little longer than I liked. Next time you'll have to do better. All right, always have a goal to aim for. So this is the Heretic here. And what we can see is, I've kind of disabled all the post-processing. And the result is that everything is just super dark. So we're going to deal with that first. But before I get into dealing with how it's dark, and you can see that the colors are kind of flat and washed out, and there's not just a not a whole lot to it there. What we're going to do is we are going to start fixing that, add some stuff, looking at how these work. Before I get into all that, though, I do want to point out that if you want to get the post-processing effect stack for HDRP, you just go to Window, and then there's Package Manager. And in Package Manager, you just want to grab the high definition render pipeline right here. And that will give you the new post-processing and everything like that. I will point out, too, that unlike this project, so don't take this project as gospel here. Unlike this project, if you actually add post-processing to your other HDRP projects, you're going to get an error because it's going to say, hey, you've redefined these things. The Heretic specifically has been built over the course of a period of time, and they've hacked the old post-processing to not throw that error. So don't be like, oh, Mike had both, so I should be able to have both. You will not be able to have both. You will not want to have post-processing installed. If you have the HDRP installed, that's enough. You will have post-processing. You won't be trying to use version 2 and the HDRP version at the same time. So if I look at my camera here, what I was kind of talking about earlier is that no longer have this post-processing layer component. Instead now, that concept is built directly into the camera itself, this volume layer mask, where I determine what layer my volumes for post-processing and my lighting and all that stuff are on. So right here, it's built in. We also have anti-aliasing built directly onto the camera. So I can see here that I have the ability right out of the box to use fast approximate anti-aliasing, or as this project uses, temporal anti-aliasing, or TAA. And so we have that right there. And then right below it are all of these physical camera settings. And we've really done a lot to increase what's available. So for the sensor type, we can choose, right now this project is using a custom, but if you're, say, familiar with film and maybe you shoot in like Super 8 and like old school vintage, or maybe you like plan on doing something that's more of an IMAX or whatever, you can choose that right here, and that's going to give you all the settings that are traditional to that camera body. You have the ability to control your sensor sizes, your ISO or ISO, your shutter speeds, focal lengths, apertures. If anyone does tilt shift photography, we can set that up here with this sort of shift. And as I talked about the aperture, blade count and curvature of the blades and things like that, you can set all that stuff up too. Again, just an extreme level of control over the way our cameras are going to work. So let's go ahead and start creating some effects and adding them to our scene to make things look a little bit better. So I'm going to look at maybe this shot right here because it's so dark, and that's going to be the one I'm going to work on the most. And so to start adding post-processing, I'm going to go ahead to my scene here, and I'm just going to go ahead and create an empty game object. And I'll call this empty game object something like post effects. There we go. And I'll just come over here to this game object, and I'm just going to add a component, and I'm going to add to this a volume. So again, ignore this post-process volume. That's the way we used to do it. That's from this hacked version. Ignore all that. This is the built-in one, volume, right? And the built-in volume has both your post-processing volume information as well as your render, your SRP volume information. So like volumetric fog and light and air density and things like that. So first off, I want to say that this is a global profile, and what that means is my camera doesn't have to be in a specific area for this profile to affect it, right? It's global. I also want to set some weight here, so I'm going to set a weight of 1. I also have a priority here. So this profile, what's its priority in the stack? Everything is about the concept of a stack. And so right now, maybe I have one profile that's applying some default baseline image effects, and I'm going to increase the profile or priority of this one to say 2, to say this one's higher priority. So if something on this profile is defined, it takes place of anything with a lower priority. So one thing may set like just a general lighting data, and then this one might say for this specific profile, for this specific shot or whatever, this takes precedence and this is going to override the other one. And I'm also going to create a new profile here. And that's just going to create one for me. And now I can start adding stuff. Now, what I see are these overrides, and if I click here, I'm going to see all the things that are both volume and post-processing. So I see things like atmospheric scattering properties, some camera properties, density volume properties, exposure, which exposure used to be a part of post-processing, but now it's not in with the post-processing because I had said before, lighting and surface stuff is not technically post-processing, now that's extracted out. right? And that's now just a part of our volume information. Under lighting, you'll see ambient occlusion, because again, that's been extracted out. That's no longer part of post-processing. That's done in the appropriate order. So I'm going to start by just clicking exposure, all right, because our scene is relatively dark. And if I click on exposure, I can tell it, okay, let's override the exposure mode. And I have a whole bunch of options here. So I could do automatic. And automatic is going to attempt to give me some automatic lighting. I also want to make sure I have muted this other track that's on here. Yes, I have. OK. The team had set this up where the timeline creates custom profiles here. And I want to make sure that was muted so it wasn't overriding anything here. So I can set up automatic. And with automatic, I can choose, all right, so what's my maybe luminance source or compensations, minimum, maximum. Why is this dark? Oh, right. I meant to do this as a teaching moment, and then I completely forgot about it, and I'm sitting there going, why isn't it working? Here's why it's not working. So no matter what I do here, nothing's going to work. It stays dark, right? And you think, well, why not? I have a volume that I've set up on the camera, the layer, and I have my volume here with this information. Well, if I recall, I go back to my camera, and I see what my volume layer mask is, this layer called volumes. Well, I created an empty game object, and that empty game object is on the layer, default, not volumes. So I need to click this dropdown and put it on the right layer so the camera sees it as something that contains a volume that it's going to work with. So once I hit that, there we go. That's what I was looking for. And so now I have the ability to say, okay, well, what's my metering mode? Do I want to average all of the light in the scene? Do I want to do just the center spot? Do I want to do center weighted? You don't see much difference in this particular shot because the center is very dark. So no matter which of these modes I choose, the illumination's about the same. But other ones that maybe have a bright center and a dark background, you'll see those metering modes have a bit of a difference to them. I could also choose curve mapping. Curve mapping allows us to do, specify actual curves. So I could do something like this. No, there we go. Or whatever. I am not a graphics guy. I have no idea what this curve actually does. All I know is if I move those things, it does that. And I'm going, if I can do it, anyone can do it. Yeah, or whatever. That looks pretty good. I could do that. I also have the ability to just use my physical camera. And so when I choose that, obviously my screen turns black. And why does my screen turn black? Well, it's not broken. But if I look at my camera here, I can see that the physical settings of this camera are that I have an aperture of 27 f/27, which is a very, very, very small aperture, and a shutter speed of 0.005 seconds, so a very, very fast shutter speed. Small aperture, fast shutter speed, very, very dark. So let's open this up. I'm going to open up the aperture a bit. I'm going to do a 5.6, which is a fairly common lens aperture. And then I'm going to set my shutter speed, let's say 30 seconds per frame, which is, ridiculous for film. But as I do that, you can see, all right, I can start to see it a little bit. And then I can take my ISO and just pump that up here. Oh, right, I got to turn off my constant copy. There we go. I have a script on here that constantly prevents me from making errors. I had to turn that off. And so now as I pump my ISO up, we can see, okay, so maybe with these particular settings on an actual camera, this is the exposure values I would get. So again, I have a bit of control over there. So let me just reset that back, because that'll affect our motion vectors and things like that. And the last thing I'm going to do on here is I'm going to say, okay, well, let's not use fixed. I'm just going to, or let's not use the camera settings. I'm just going to go fixed because that's what the team originally set it up as. And I'll set this shot to something like that. And so that's the exposure. There we go, and that works relatively well. And so again, I have options as to, am I using a fixed amount? Am I using physical camera settings or whatever? And as I kind of showed a moment ago, you also have the ability for a project like this where you have all these shots in the same project, you're not going to want the same exposure on each particular shot. And so you can actually set up timeline tracks to control these volumes to say, okay, for this shot you're going to do this, for this shot you're going to do this, and so on and so forth. And so I'll just come back here, but these are all things that we have control over. And so the next one I want to talk about is depth of field. Now, depth of field is a super fun one, though it can be weird when you're like, why won't this work? But I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to add this, and now that is a post-processing effect here. And so I'm just going to go to my depth of field. And I'm going to look here, and so my focus mode, I can do manual, and manual allows me just to say, okay, forget what kind of camera I have, let's just manually dial some values in. And so I can set a start and an end for my near blur. So depth of field works like this. Depth of field has a range somewhere in front of you where everything is sharp. And anything in front of that range is blurry, and everything behind that range is blurry. And you can think of it like two gradients if you want, or just some zone of accuracy. And so with manual, I define where's the start and end of that near blur, and where's the start and end of that far blur. And so with my near blur, I just bring this in here, and I think it's somewhere around like 0.6. So we can see that coin is sharply in focus, somewhere there. And then I can start bringing in my far blur, to where basically I just want his face out of focus. Somewhere like that. There we go. And so now the coin, very sharp and focused, his face very out of focus. And this is manual. It has nothing to do with my camera settings in any way. This is, I just want to cheat. Let me just dial in some numbers, and let's get the effect that I want. Now, the other thing I can do besides manual is I can actually use the physical camera settings. And so with the physical camera settings, if I go again to my camera and I look at it and I see that, again, it's gonna be reset here. So I'm gonna have a focal length of 140, so it's a 140 millimeter lens. Let me set this to something like a 100 meter lens or millimeter lens. And then again, I'm gonna open my aperture up because the wider the aperture, the more depth of field I can pull out of this. And so I'll just set those there. And once I've set up that focal length and that aperture, now I can just come to my post effects and I can say, all right, well, so what is my focal distance? Where in my scene am I focusing? So if I bring this in a little bit, I can see somewhere around there brings his eyes into focus, but not the coin, or somewhere in there brings the coin into focus, but not his eyes. So I've defined a shallow depth of field, and now it's just a matter of pointing it at something, right? So fairly straightforward. There we go. All right, and so again, that's another one of those settings that's really part of the physical camera settings. Now, these are important, all right? So depth of field, as was mentioned this morning during the keynote, depth of field is used in every single shot in this video. And again, as I'd mentioned before, a lot of this is about subtlety, a lot of it is about style and emotion, but more importantly, it's about drawing the viewer's eye. Depth of field is super important for that because you always want to tell the viewers what to look at, and viewers will naturally look at the thing that's in focus and ignore everything that's not in focus, right? So by using this, we have huge amounts of control of determining where people look in our frames to build these scenes and do all this really cool stuff. But again, as I mentioned, if you have multiple scenes like this, you're definitely going to want to set up multiple volumes for your different depth of fields, because you can see if I try to use this one, say, here, everything is super blurry and whatever, and I need to go to my camera and actually tell it to start matching the timeline again, but everything becomes just crazy blurry everywhere, all right? And so you would need one of these per shot, and that's normal. That's normal to do so that we can get exactly what it is we're trying to do. So those are some of our physically accurate ones, and I will turn off depth of field for now, but let's look at some of our more fun ones. All right, so I like this particular shot here because this allows me to add one of my favorite effects, which is chromatic aberration. And for anyone who doesn't know, chromatic aberration is color banding that happens from refraction on a lens. Think of like one of those prisms where the light goes in that's white and then splits out in a rainbow. That's chromatic aberration. And so you really see it around edges, especially with white light. And so I'm going to go to Add Overrides, and I'm going to go to my post-processing, and I'm going to add some chromatic aberration. And what was enabled in HDRP, what's something that's new here, is with version 2 of post-processing, the range of our chromatic aberration was relatively limited, because it was limited, in that case, quite ironically, to more physically accurate ranges. And even though HDRP is all about physically accurate, with this one, they took it extreme, so you could do hyper-realistic, beyond physically accurate for some of those just really like wild effects that you may want to do in film. And so I can turn on some intensity here, and I can start just pulling on this, and you can see more of the light being separated out, more being separated out. And this is about where it stopped in version 2 with your capabilities. But what we've added is even more. So you can get really extreme with your chromatic aberration if you want. Which gives you that sort of, oh, I'm in a dream sensation, or maybe my character's drunk or whatever, right? Obviously something is not quite right here. I've eaten a bunch of really bad mushrooms, I'm not sure. But that is this chromatic aberration effect, which is just really cool. So it's one of my favorites there. So besides chromatic aberration, let's look at some of the other ones that we can have a lot of fun with. And so the next one I want to check out here is I'm going to check out, what am I looking for here? I'm going to look up some lens distortion. Lens distortion also really cool. So this enables me to do things like fisheye lens. So I can do stuff like this, or just bring things in quite a bit. So again, take things to extreme as far as stylization. And something new that we can do with this is we can determine where the center of our distortion is. So we can roll things around like so, and just, again, do some really neat things with our images. And there's a special type of distortion, so I'll just go ahead and turn this off. Special type of distortion that's now built into post-processing that we see all the time in movies. And what that is where we're looking at something, the main character like focuses on their face while the background pulls way out, and that is called the Panini Distortion, not anything related to the food. And so I'll just click here, and what this enables me to do is it enables me to pull the center forward while the background sort of gets pushed away. Now it can kind of be hard to see how that's different from the fisheye lens until I turn off my crop, and so you can see the effect this is having, where it effectively rolls away to give me that the front kind of pulls in and the back sort of rolls away, and it gives us that really cool effect there that's used a lot. So, all right, so one of the few things I'm gonna wrap up here and talk about, I have to cut this a little short because my next talk is in the next room. It starts at the exact moment this one stops, so yeah. So yeah, we're gonna kind of wrap up here. So the next thing I want to talk about is this color grading that we had mentioned. So I'm gonna go to Add Override, and I'm gonna go to my post-processing. And before there was color grading, but now there's all sorts of ones. So I can do things like split toning, where I can say, let's make my shadows very red and my highlights super green. This is the Christmas version of the Heretic, or as I like to call it, look, I'm an Instagram artist. And this enables us to maybe do something like this, where we can make our shadows and our highlights different colors there to add some cool image effects, retro effects, whatever. What I'm going to do here is I could go through my post-processing here, and I could add things like color adjustments and color curves and shadows, midtones, highlights. These are those trackballs we're all familiar with. And I can add just all sorts of color tone mapping and stuff like that, white balancing, all of these things. But we have this thing called color lookup. And color lookup is cool because that allows us to basically do all color corrections in one, right? We have the ability to create things called lookup tables, or LUTs, as we may call them. And by creating a lookup table, which you can do in, say, Photoshop or DaVinci Resolve or whatever, and bring that into your project here, that's what the system's going to do. It's going to say, OK, well, I have this color, or this light, this whatever. What does that come out as on the other side? And instead of all these tweaks to all these different types of color effects here in the Heretic project, they've just generated a bunch of lookup tables that make this process fairly simple. And so what I'm going to do is, on my color lookup, I'm just going to go to my texture. I'm going to type LUT for lookup table, and I'm just going to grab this yellow 2 here, and then this is where all that coloring came from. You can see what a huge difference that makes in our project. Now, I would not be complete with a post-processing talk if I didn't very quickly talk about bloom, which is my super favorite post-effect of all time. However, the HDRP bloom is really disappointing because it's actually physically accurate, and that's not what I want. I want completely unrealistic. So unfortunately, what I actually want is a completely different effect. But this is very accurate bloom, which is very efficient. And so what bloom is effectively is what we're seeing here. Bloom is basically where light hits imperfections in a piece of glass in a camera lens and causes basically this, refraction, scattering, fog, right? This is actually what bloom is, not the, hey, I'm going to crank up the bloom and my lights are going to spike out and I'm going to get all these crazy flashes. That's not actually bloom, even though that's basically what we call it. This is real, accurate bloom. And so I'm able to see just how we can set this up here. And again, we tend to want subtlety. But one cool thing we can do with bloom that's not subtle, which is why I still love it, is I can create lens dirt. And lens dirt allows me to apply a texture to my lenses to simulate dirt. And so right now I've added this, and it's, again, very subtle. You probably would never see it unless some light was hitting your lens in a special way. You can kind of see a little bit here. But what I can do is I can take the intensity of this and I can spike this up. Because what this emulates is light hitting the imperfections on a lens and flaring, right? Which is just this really cool thing to do. Now, this is something that I may want for maybe this shot right here, where the light is going directly into the camera, but I don't want that to happen all the time, and so I have the ability to do this. I'm going to set this to actually a much lower number here, and instead of trying to animate this here, this intensity right here, which is part of an asset, part of this profile, which cause all sorts of issues, you know, we basically don't want to try to do that. I'm going to create another post-processing volume. So I'm going to go to another game object, create empty. I know I'm almost at the time, but I'm just going to keep going quickly. Volumes, and I'm just going to add a volume to this. I'm going to give it a, say it's global, give it a priority of say 3, add a new profile to it. And on this one, what I'm going to do, so this is a higher priority, right? So I'm going to go post-processing, bloom on here, and the only thing I need to override, I can leave everything, I don't even have to add a texture because the one below it adds a texture. All I need to do is change the intensity. And so on here, I'm just going to crank this one up higher, say like this, okay? And now, instead of trying to adjust this bloom here on the profile, I can actually just adjust the weight of this volume component. Now that is something we can animate very easily. And the weight goes from 0 to 100% of how it's applied. And so what that means is I could create an animation that keeps this volume basically off until maybe here, where the volume would be turned on because the light is hitting it. So that's exactly what I did. If I look at my timeline here, I have this animation track that's looking for a volume.weight. And if I look at the keyframes here, I can see they go from 0 to 1, and then 1 back down to 0. And so all I'm going to do is I'm going to drop this game object directly on there, create an animator on that. And so now that's effectively what happens. If we watch the weight right here, we can see it turns blue because it's controlled by the timeline. And so I can see that, okay, it's off, the light peaks around the guy's head, flares, hand goes up, blocks the light, there we go. Very complex effect that has a ton of realism for basically no effort. Very, very simple, very easy to do. And maybe that flare is a bit extreme, but I like it a bit extreme. So there we go. All right, so that's going to wrap up my talk here. And like I said, I do need to jut over to the next talk immediately after this. But if you do have questions, feel free to either follow me or wait for me at the end of that talk. I'd be happy to talk to you about post-processing effect stuff. Thank you all for attending, and enjoy your Unite Sydney.